Bottesini's Ali Baba, reconstructed by Maestro Anthony Barrese, opens this Sunday for 3 performances, an Opera Southwest production at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Maestro Barrese and Ashraf Sewailam, who plays Ali Baba, join me in the studio today. Welcome.
Hi, Frank.
Hi.
So, as a character, this guy is rich, but he's always paranoid about losing his money, right?
And he's always hunting for more money. He'd do anything for it. So yeah, it's both.
Including essentially, as in many operas, selling off his daughter to
the head of customs, so that the head of customs looks the other way regarding the contraband that he has just acquired, 40 barrels of coffee.
And he manages to get the secret to open this secret cave, loses it, and in the end is punished terribly, right?
He is, and I'm really happy about the ending of the story, the whole modification of the story, because as a kid growing up in Egypt, I always had a moral dilemma with Ali Baba being a good guy who has a happy ending, and he never has to pay any consequence for his greed. So this one, actually, I didn't know that a modified version of the story existed until Tony contacted me about the role.
So was this originally written this way by Bottesini and his librettist?
Yeah, and the libretto is based on a libretto written for a different opera of Ali Baba by Cherubini, which was written in French a number of years beforehand. And the libretto got a lot of flack for not being true to the original story. But this libretto by Emilio Taddei is an almost literal translation of the French libretto. So someone modified it, and then Taddei just simply translated it into Italian.
Now, this is an opera that's been lost for generations.
Yes. Nobody alive has heard it, and nobody alive knows anybody who probably heard. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
it's that far removed from.
Last time it was done in the 1870s.
1870s, yeah.
And so, did you reconstruct the score from the original manuscript?
Yes,
Were there parts?
From the original manuscript recording. Now, instead of sending microfilm, they sent me high-resolution digital photographs of it, and you can kind of blow them up whatever size you want. And Bottesini actually has a very beautiful handwriting, very clear and very easy to read. I used that as the primary source. There were a couple of different piano vocal scores written at the time that had some discrepancies with them. And then, of course, there's the printed libretto. So I had a bit of information to work from. And as I said, it was quite clear. His handwriting, it was very beautiful. And so it didn't present that many problems. So Amleto took, about 10, 12 years. This took about 4 years.
Where does Bottesini fall in the pantheon of composers? We know him mostly for his bass concerto.
Yeah, I mean, any bass player knows Bottesini. They know every single bass, and some violin players do too, because he wrote a concerto for double bass and violin. And he's mostly known, yeah, like you said, for his double bass music, but he did write about 12 operas. I mean, he wasn't just a double bass virtuoso, and he was a conductor, and he had a full schedule conducting, composing, and performing. So he's right in that period, sort of late or middle to late Verdi, right around there, right before Verismo, I would say, kind of like on the cutting edge between late Romantic Italian opera and the beginning of Verismo.
So Ashraf, as a singer, are there challenges that this music presents?
The music as a style, vocal writing style, it is a fusion between Bellini, Verdi and Rossini, and it being a comedy in the late 19th century, it was a little difficult to have it succeed, have it receive wide success, but it's very gratifying to sing. You get vocal line, you get beautiful melodies, but you also get patter, a couple of coloratura phrases, and you get a heavy dose of Verdi in the ensembles, and you get a heavy dose of Bellini in the melodies, and you get a heavy dose of Rossini in the patter. So it's challenging in the fact that it is perceived instrumentally, conceived instrumentally. He was an instrumentalist first and foremost, and he wrote his ensembles like he was writing for an orchestra. So it takes quite a bit more time to internalize the harmonic shifts, because think of yourself as a double bass or a cello player sitting in front of the score. reading it is very difficult from memorizing it and integrating it into the action. So it's taking a bit more work than if you were memorizing a Verdi ensemble.
So unlike another composer who might have had a soprano who he was in love with and
Right.
knew how to write for vocal scores, does that make it a challenge to conduct as well?
Well, weirdly, no, because this is one of the few operas that we've played that is written by a string player. So he knew, even though there's some very fiendishly virtuosic, difficult string writing, it all makes sense. Whereas Wagner didn't know at all how to play a violin, and it sort of, now Wagner's music is part of what is expected from people technically, but at the time, it was just unplayable. No string player, even at the time of this, would have said it was unplayable. And Bottesini, being the music director of the Lyceum Theatre in London, where this was premiered, would have had to have written music that would have been more practical. So from an orchestral point of view, it really flows quite nicely, and it lives in an idiom that is very comfortable for everyone to play. And in addition to that, I keep thinking of Mahler, and I mean, bear with me for a second, because even though this doesn't sound anything like Mahler, Bottesini had the benefit of being a conductor. So he not only knew how to play the double bass, but he knew what one oboe and one clarinet sounded like, or a piccolo and a flute in octaves. Like, he knew, not that Verdi didn't know these things, but he didn't live them every day the way that Bottesini did. So being in front of an orchestra the way Mahler was in front of an orchestra all the time, he had a much better ear for making a wider palette of color, which I think is just apparent on every page of the score. You guys haven't heard it yet, because we've been in the rehearsal room with the piano, and just being in front of the orchestra, it's just like, wow, there's just so much going on in the sounds of it that you can't.
I can't wait to be with the orchestra, because it's already quite satisfying. It's like a nice piece of steak to sing this music. It's a solid opera full of beauty and fun, and I can't wait to hear the orchestra, because just like you hear a lot of it in the piano accompaniment, but I can't wait to hear what he wrote for the orchestra.
And so Bottesini also had a good idea of balance then, probably between vocalists and
I mean,
orchestra
yes,
as well.
but like Ashraf said, a lot of this is conceived kind of more instrumentally. You hear, the Ali Baba lines, and they're supported by a cello, and they kind of, in some ways, seem more like Beethoven has this issue sometimes too. It is a little bit more instrumental, but he never. The nice thing about this piece is it never really. There are surprises in it, but you're never just completely blown away by anything harmonic. It lives very comfortably in the late 19th century idiom, harmonically and orchestrally, and even vocally, of what's going on. I would say that the most interesting thing about it is that it will sound 1 minute like Rossini, 1 minute like Donizetti, and then 1 minute like something you don't even know. So it's a very comfortable. It sounds like something you know, but you don't know it.
It sounds like a great opera for people who love Bellini or Verdi or Rossini.
And Bellini. When was the last time you saw a Bellini comedy, or except for Falstaff? When was the last time you saw who saw Un Giorno di Regno by Verdi? Like, all these guys, even Rossini stopped writing comic operas about halfway through his career. Donizetti was the only one who continued to kind of mix serious and comic. But by the time you get to the 1870s, virtually no composer in the Italian school was writing comedies.
And it wasn't until Verdi wrote Falstaff in the 80s.
Right.
1880s, yeah.
And even that was just kind of a one-off, and Puccini had a one-off late in his career. But really, Italian opera by that time was synonymous with melodrama and people dying at the end.
Well, that was part of being seen as a serious composer as you moved to the drama.
And he did write serious operas too, but this was considered his comic. That's what I think I read somewhere. This was considered his comic masterpiece, and I thought, okay, I love the story of Ali Baba, and I was curious what he could bring to it.
Yet the score is also full of the serious sonorities.
Sure.
All the melodramatic sounds, and
when someone gets angry, it's sometimes it's comical, but sometimes it's actually very frightening.
It sounds like it's a great mix, actually. Like, he really knew what he was doing.
Yeah, he was a composer. I mean, this was not his first rodeo. I think it was his seventh or eighth opera. I mean, he had written a number of things. He had a lot of experience in both composition and performing and conducting operas. So unlike with Amleto, which was his second opera with Faccio, this was a much more mature composer who had clearer ideas of what he wanted.
So what happened to the score? Why was it lost?
I mean, I don't think it was lost so much as it was done. It was popular. Then people moved on.
Well, back in those days, you didn't necessarily have a season where you brought back the audiences wanted new operas.
Yeah, with very few exceptions, things weren't brought back.
I think the thing about its popularity or the fact that it did not continue being successful had to do with the fact that it did not do anything groundbreaking. at the time, Verdi and Wagner were, it's like with every opera, there was a new frontier with the musical style and the dramatic style. But I actually like the dramatic structure very much. It's quite forward-looking. It presents Ali Baba's daughter, Delia, sung by Monica Yunus, as a feisty woman who kind of rises up against her very patriarchal father, especially within the perceived Islamic culture that takes place at the time in Isfahan, where the opera is set. So it's quite forward-looking when it comes to the female character.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that he wrote it for London, and it didn't really go anywhere but out. I mean, he was in London at the time, and it was done for about a decade with quite a bit of success in London, but he didn't bring it to Italy or anywhere else. And so it was to my knowledge, it was never done in Italian. He wrote it in Italian, but it was probably only ever performed in English. It was done twice in Spain around the same time, and it was done in Spanish. But it was, he wrote it in Italian, but it was never performed in Italian, only in English and Spanish, from what we can tell.
And this performance is Italian with English subtitles?
Exactly, yep.
And I believe it's going to make it big around the world, because in this day and age, you have an opera that is very pleasing orally, in terms of just the beauty of the music, but also it's dramatically forward-looking. The whole treatment of the moral issue with Ali Baba and the way the female character is presented, both of them are relevant to today's issues.
And Opera Wire said this was the #1 production to see in America this fall.
Yeah, the #1. We beat Chicago Lyric and the Met and everybody, because this is just so off the beaten path. Pretty much everything else that was in that list was a rarity. This is beyond rarity. This is because people, some orchestra members have been writing me in the run up to this. Where can I get a recording of this? And I just keep saying, barring a time machine, I can't. There is nothing.
Yeah, there's an overture, right?
There's an overture, and that's been recorded a number of times. Yeah.
And very few opera fans and even opera singers knew anything about Bottesini until we were told about it.
Yeah.
Only instrumentalists know Bottesini. Whenever I mention the work to an instrumentalist, oh yes, of course he's a double bass composer, and it's like, yes, and an opera composer as well.
Yeah, and I didn't even know he was an opera composer. And what I'm discovering is, if you were a composer in Italy between the time of maybe like the late 1700s and the beginning of the 20th century, if you were any kind of composer, you were also an opera composer, unless you were just a church composer, and that was all you. But even a lot of them, just everybody wrote operas.
That was what the popular music was.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Ali Baba opens this Sunday and plays for 3 performances at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Tickets at operasouthwest.org or at the NHCC box office 724-4771. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.